The Manhattan Bridge has carried New York City across the river for more than a century, and yet there were times when the city repeatedly questioned whether or not it should exist at all. You see, since its opening in 1909, the bridge has served as one of the city's most important transit crossings, carrying subway trains, vehicles, and pedestrians between Manhattan and Brooklyn daily. From the onset, it drew criticism for its cost, its disruptive construction, and the decision to carry heavy railway traffic along the outer edges of the structure, a design choice that subjected the bridge to constant, uneven stress. But these issues were known from the start. In fact, early skeptics warned of the stresses that the design would impose, as authorities debated whether or not the bridge or the concept was even appropriate for the growing city. As at the time, many were arguing that tunnels beneath the river were the better answer. They asserted that the Manhattan Bridge represented an expensive experiment that locked the city into long-term problems. And here's the peculiar thing. Despite the fact that we know this beautiful bridge from photographs, until the mid-20th century, that debate never really ended. And at a few points, the city actually debated removing the bridge altogether, which raises a question that few people ask today. Why would a city depend so heavily on a bridge that it never fully trusted? And how did a structure once viewed as a liability become a permanent and now very famous part of New York's landscape? Stay tuned to find out as we explore the unusual story of the Manhattan Bridge. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Before the Manhattan Bridge was ever proposed, New York City already had a problem. Manhattan was growing faster than it geographically allowed, and there was no end in sight, as by the late 19th century, the island had become the economic and population center of the region, while Brooklyn, then still an independent city, was expanding just as rapidly across the East River. This posed a major complication, since millions of people lived on the opposite side of the water from where they worked, and that meant they had to constantly cross this inconvenient body of water. For decades, ferries carried that burden. Outside of poor weather, they were reliable, but they were slow and limited. And as traffic increased, they became inadequate for a city that was industrializing at full speed. The first permanent solution arrived in 1883 with the opening of the beautiful Brooklyn Bridge. It was an engineering triumph and a psychological breakthrough, proof that the East River could be conquered by steel and stone. Almost immediately, this transformed the commuting patterns, property values, and relationship between cities. And of course, the success also created some new problems. The Brooklyn Bridge filled up faster than anyone expected. By the end of the century, it was already strained by streetcars, wagons, pedestrians, and early motor traffic, exposing the limits of having one single crossing. So New York set out to build another bridge. The Williamsburg Bridge opened in 1903, designed explicitly to move enormous numbers of people, particularly the working-class commuters who traveled between Brooklyn and the Lower East Side. It also carried rail, road, and foot traffic. For a time, it did relieve the pressure, but once again, demand surged. As Brooklyn continued to grow and the transit networks expanded, two bridges were no longer enough. In fact, they kind of amplified the problem. With each new crossing, there was accelerated growth and commuting, while binding the city more tightly to fixed infrastructure. So by the early 20th century, city planners were already discussing a third bridge, one designed to move larger volumes of people more efficiently right into Manhattan. But not everyone agreed that another bridge was the answer. Critics pointed to the cost. For example, they criticized the land condemnations required for long approach ramps and the way that the bridge construction would reshape dense neighborhoods. At the same time, tunnel advocates argued that going underground would help avoid wind, vibration, and surface congestion, since they required no towering approaches and no sweeping demolitions above the ground. Rail traffic could also be isolated underground, away from weather and structural fatigue. To them, bridges were a 19th century solution, being stretched into the 20th century. Still, bridges retained political momentum over a less visible alternative like a tunnel. Remember, something visible like a bridge could also serve as validation for a politician's success. So, despite the objections, New York City committed to another crossing, one that would be designed not just to supplement existing bridges, but to absorb the heaviest transit loads the the city could generate. That decision would result in the construction of the Manhattan Bridge. Once the decision was made, New York moved quickly. From the beginning, capacity drove every design choice. The bridge was treated as a corrective object, prioritizing high-capacity movement between Brooklyn and Manhattan. Unlike the Brooklyn Bridge, which was balanced traffic types on a single deck, the Manhattan Bridge was designed mostly for rail transit. Multiple railway tracks were integrated into the single structure, positioned along the outer edges of the span to enable uninterrupted through service between boroughs. This was deliberate. City officials and transit planners expected rail traffic to dominate the future of the crossing. Subways were expanding, so any new bridge that failed to prioritize trains would be seen as obsolete almost immediately. Anyhow, construction crews began in the early 20th century amidst dense neighborhoods, active waterfronts, and intense political scrutiny. Massive steel towers rose on both sides of the river, suspension cables were spun across the span, and below them, the decks were constructed to accommodate all manner of traffic. The scale of the project was immense. Long approach ramps had to be driven deep into Brooklyn and Manhattan, requiring extensive land condemnation and the reshaping of entire blocks. Hence, critics remained vocal, questioning the cost, disruption, and viability of rail-heavy bridge construction. Even so, the construction continued, propelled by urgency rather than consensus. By the time the bridge neared completion, confidence returned, with newspapers celebrating its size, engineers praising its capacity, and officials hailing it as a modern solution for a modern city. When the Manhattan Bridge opened to traffic in 1909, trains began running almost immediately, followed by vehicles and then pedestrians, and the bridge quickly proved to be effective in relieving pressure on older crossings, as well as accelerating the rate of movement between boroughs. But beneath that early success, the bridge was already being pushed to its limits, a reality that would be a major issue in the years to come. The warning signs emerged gradually, but they were unmistakable to those closely watching. Shortly after the bridge entered full subway service, engineers began recording behavior that exceeded ordinary suspension motion. The structure didn't simply flex under weight, it twisted. Trains running along one side of the span introduced a rolling, torsional motion that could be felt across the deck, a response directly tied to the placement of heavy rail traffic along the bridge's outer edge. Initially, these movements were regarded as manageable, though as decades passed and the rail service intensified, the consequences became harder to contain. With accelerated fatigue in floor beams, loosened connections, and cracking in members once expected to remain stable, routine maintenance became targeted intervention. By the mid-20th century, this situation was no longer theoretical. Newspaper reports began documenting emergency repairs carried out while trains and vehicles continued to pass overhead. In one widely cited account, crews were described as reinforcing damaged steel under live traffic condition, a measure taken not because it was ideal, but because shutting the bridge down was impossible by this point. And although inconvenient, officials reassured the public that there was no danger of collapse, though the scale and frequency of these repairs escalated. Service disruptions followed as each repair addressed an immediate failure point, but none resolved the overall underlying structural imbalance created by the bridge's original design. By the 1950s and 60s, the conversation had shifted decisively. The question was no longer how to fix the Manhattan Bridge, rather, it was whether continued investment made sense at all. Engineering assessments frequently framed the problem in stark terms. The very feature that made the bridge indispensable, its ability to carry multiple subway lines, was also the force accelerating its deterioration. Every train that crossed helped keep the city moving, while at the same time adding stress to a structure that already showed signs of long-term fatigue. And it was also around this time that the alternatives were starting to demonstrate their benefit. As East River tunnels expanded, they offered a more stable and predictable way to carry rail traffic, avoiding the exposure and asymmetric stress that burdened the Manhattan Bridge. And this changed the tone of the official debate. Planning documents and public statements began treating the bridge not as a public asset, but as a problem to be managed. Some proposals focused on diverting rail traffic elsewhere, effectively sidelining the structure. Others went further, questioning whether the bridge should continue to exist at all. Former city officials and planners argued openly that the Manhattan Bridge represented an outdated approach to urban infrastructure, a relic of an earlier era, competing with systems better suited to a modern city. By the late 20th century, the stakes were clear. The city was already committed to maintaining multiple river crossings. For the first time since its opening, the Manhattan Bridge was being evaluated not on what it symbolized, but on what it demanded and what it delivered. That evaluation led to a conclusion that would have seemed impossible in 1909. A conclusion that removing the bridge, or at least replacing its function, might be easier than saving it. By the late 20th century, New York faced a choice that had been postponed for decades, since the bridge could no longer be maintained through piecemeal fixes alone. After years of emergency repairs and service diversions, it became unavoidable that keeping the Manhattan Bridge in service would require a comprehensive, long-term intervention. That intervention was expensive. Reports and public statements from the period made it clear that stabilizing the bridge would take years and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. This is because stabilization required replacing steel, correcting load paths, and carefully reintroducing subway service in stages to balance structural limits with the city's transportation needs. Though when compared to the alternatives, the math began to change. As you might imagine, replacing the bridge outright meant more than dismantling steel towers and cables. It meant undoing an entire transportation spine. By then, subway lines depended on the bridge. Traffic patterns formed around it, and entire neighborhoods on both sides of the river were shaped by its approaches, meaning at this point, even the critics who once argued for abandonment acknowledged the scale of disruption that removing the bridge would cause. And with that, over time, the city committed to rehabilitation rather than replacement. The work was slow as sections of the bridge were closed for years at a time. What's more, subway service was sometimes rerouted and then restored, and then rerouted again as reinforcement campaigns progressed. Each phase addressed not just damage, but the structural imbalance that had defined the bridge since its opening. Gradually, the crisis receded. By the time full service was restored, the Manhattan Bridge had crossed a threshold. It was no longer a liability under constant evaluation. It was the infrastructure that the city had chosen to keep. Today, the bridge is still one of the most heavily used crossings in New York, and from street level, it appears unchanged. A familiar presence spanning the East River, framed by cables and towers that seem permanent. But in the end, that permanence was only guaranteed by the fact that the Manhattan Bridge served a city that could no longer function without it. We'll leave it there for today, but I hope you liked the episode. Otherwise, until next time, this is Ryan Socash signing off.